And we're back. And we are going to talk about gradients. And don't mind me, if you've been listening to any of the tutorials, which I'm sure you have, I say we a lot, even though there's only one person doing it. It's because I always think highly of myself, so don't mind me. I am going to be discussing gradients with you today. So gradients, everybody knows, are a gradation or a smooth transition from one color to another or one opacity to another opacity. If you saw the mesh tutorial, which you should have, and if you have a chance, you should go back and check it out. The mesh tutorial actually that covers gradations using a mesh and using the mesh tool. Well, we're just going to talk about basic gradients today. So if you look in your tools panel, again, yours is normally going to be located on the left hand side. You adjust your panels however you want. This is just how I like mine. Conserves and consolidates space. It is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th row down, and if you have the 2 column, it's in the second column, which makes it number 20, or it just means the 20th down in a single column. Okay? And the shortcut for it is the G key on your keyboard. Very simple to remember, G for gradient. That's another thing I like about Illustrator. All of the keys are pretty much self-explanatory. If you're a Photoshop person, you know there are shortcuts that are in Photoshop for the key commands, but I actually think the key command shortcuts in Illustrator are more intuitive and they're more logical. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a shape. Let's create a rectangle. Pull that rectangle out. If you don't know how to create a shape, there is a tutorial on shape creation, the types of shapes that you can create, and you can check that out too. But we're going to create a shape. It doesn't matter what the fill is at this moment, but we're going to create a shape. And once we have our rectangle on the artboard, we are going to select that rectangle, and then we are going to head on over to our gradient panel. And if you don't have that up, you go to Window, you go down to Gradient, and it will pop up. And you can then select your type of gradient. There are 2 types of gradients. There is a linear gradient and there is a radial gradient. Alright? So you're going to click this. Let's select linear. And linear is just as you would think. It goes in a line, straight line, either from one point to another. That's it. So it goes from point A to point B. Now, when you do this, if you look in your gradient panel, there is an angle section. Now, I'm skipping this section that says stroke because not all versions of Illustrator actually have this option. So the stroke option may not be there. So if it's not there, don't mind it. We're going to cover a way to use that without it actually being an option if you have an older version of Illustrator. So you click your current gradient, and you'll notice that you have an option that says angle. And if you click in there, you can change the angle of your gradient. You'll notice that it's actually changing and moving around as I change the angle. You can also reverse it by clicking on this button, which is right under your swatch for your gradient. And when you do that, it completely reverses the angle. So let's see. If we were to change it to -110, it's going to change that angle in the gradient. The angle will remain the same, but it will change the way the gradient is coming from which color to which color. So if the black in our gradient, which is going from black to white, starts in the lower left as black and goes to the upper right as white, that means the lower left will be white and the upper right will be black, and that's what we get when we reverse the gradient. So you can do that, and you can shift and pull the angle. And another feature is you can actually change your gradient colors. Alright? If you double click on the swatch slider that's underneath, for that particular color, if you double click on it, it gives you an option where you can change the slider, you can change the opacity, you can click swatches, and it'll bring up your current swatches, and you can change it to one of the swatches that are in your swatch panel. Then you can go back. You can actually change the color mode. Now, if you notice, when we originally were doing this and we double clicked on our black swatch, you notice that it only gave us the K, and that's because this is just key color black. So it's not any specific color mode other than grayscale. If you want to change the color mode, you're going to have to click in your options drop down arrow, which is in the upper right of that specific panel, and then you can change your color mode accordingly. I normally, of course, like I said, I work in CMYK, but you could change it to RGB, CMYK, and you can change the colors accordingly. So we'll change it to RGB just to do something different. And you'll notice that the colors where our black was originally selected is now a green color. And we could do the same for the white. Change the color mode to RGB, and we can change it to a dark blue. Alright, and this is what it would look like in that gradation. So this is our gradient. Now we have the option, if we want, we can switch to a radial gradient. Okay, if we do that, you'll notice that it makes it a radial gradient. And just like before, we can reverse it. And what it does is it switches the location of the colors. If the green is on the inside and the blue is on the outside, now the blue will be on the inside and the green on the outside. See? Now, changing the angle in this doesn't really do anything. Not at this point. And that's only because this is a perfect circle. Okay? But if we were to change by increasing or decreasing in terms of the height versus the width, you'll notice we then have more of an ellipse or oval shape, which we can then change the angle and it would manipulate it accordingly. Okay? Everything else is still the same. But just like in our linear function, we can actually add different points just by clicking on the slider areas underneath. And when we do that, we can change each of these to different colors. We can double click, change it to another color, or we can grab a color from our swatch, drag it over that actual swatch that's underneath on the slider, and then it will change to that color. And we can shift and pull these so that the gradient area actually changes how close they are in proximity to one another for the different colors. You can also change according to how you want that gradation strength to be between the midpoint, which is technically the midpoint, of one of the colors to the other. So essentially that's what this is. It's a gradient slider on the top, and the bottom is just where you change your colors. So if you notice, when I move the bottom color, it proportionately moves the sliders that are on the left and right side of that color. But I can move those sliders individually for those colors without actually having to touch the bottom swatch, and it will change accordingly. But then once I move it again, they both move accordingly. You'll notice how sharp that one is now that I've moved it so close. We can move it back and we can change, and we can do a lot of things. Now that's how you add those points and manipulate them. But you can drag them off. If you want to delete them, you can select one and you can drag it down and that'll remove it. Or you can click it and click the delete stop button and it will remove one. Very simple, very easy. Now, that's how you're working it while you're in your gradient panel. But let's go back to a default gradient. If we were to click the G button, we'll now have our gradient slider live on the board, and we can actually change this, which is easier than just fooling around with the numbers. We can change the direction, change the length by grabbing the end of the actual gradient slider, and we can change the distance the swatch starts with the color and where it ends. Then you can reposition this, you can move it back, move it farther forward. Again, a lot of options. You can still add your points. You can drag them off to get rid of them, and you can change your slider points. Everything is the same, except you're doing it live and on the board. The only thing that would differ is when you're doing this and you want to change the transparency, you would have to double click, and then once you double click, you can then change the location and the opacity of that specific point. And don't mind me, I'm actually using a tablet, so when I'm doing this sometimes it takes a little longer because I have to click on the exact point, but let me show you just using my touchpad. If you double click, boom, there you got it. You can change the opacity of that point. You can change the different colors and the location. So let's go here, see what happens if we change the opacity to this, maybe to 60, and you'll notice it lightens up. We can change the location to maybe 40, and you see how it moves closer. So you have your options, all the same, except you're doing it live and on your artboard. Now that we have this out of the way, we're going to, let's create another rectangle. But this time we're going to create a stroke on the rectangle, and let's make that stroke 10. Let's make it 30, just so we can see it. While we have this stroke out here, you'll notice that, again, in your gradients panel, there was a stroke option. And what you can do now, what you couldn't do in previous versions of Adobe Illustrator, is you can create a stroke that has a specific gradient. Now, let's select our basic gray, black, white gradient. You'll notice now, if we were to select this, our stroke options are highlighted. And we can do just like we did before, and we can change the angle. But you can only do that depending upon which option you've selected. Right now it's apply gradient within stroke. So it sees the stroke itself as a fill, but it keeps it as an actual stroke. And then what it does is it allows us to manipulate it just as if it was a fill. So it's basically seeing, and I'll use this as an option. Don't mind my error noise. But let's take this off and change this to red. But essentially it sees this is our black point and this is our white point, and it pretends all of this in the middle is a fill and that this stroke is a part of it. So it naturally just takes the gradation from point A to point B. And that's all it's doing. So it's nothing complicated, very simple. Now, your other options under the stroke option, this one was apply gradient within stroke. Your middle option is apply gradient along stroke. And what it does is it picks a starting point for the first swatch of your gradient, and then it picks the point directly next to it. Like if the starting point was 0 and it goes to 100, 0 is the starting point and your last swatch's point is 100. So they're literally back to back. So it's going from the white all the way around till it reaches black, which connects with it here. And you'll notice you don't have the angle option anymore. That's not there. But you do have the option to reverse the gradient. And you'll notice how it switches from one side to the next. Okay? You can also, again, change the slider, add different points, manipulate it like that, so you get different things. Now, let's take those off and go back to what it originally looked like. And our last option is apply gradient across the stroke. Now what this does is it takes the gradient and it goes from the inside of the stroke to the outside of the stroke. And that's how it is. Now if you remember similar to how the width tool worked, this only works when there are two sides to the stroke, which means that you cannot use it when it has a line stroke to inside or a line stroke to outside. It's only when it's a line stroke to center, because the center gives you a top and a bottom, or a left and a right side to the stroke. Okay? Once you do that, you'll be able to manipulate it just like you did anything else, and you can change how far out one swatch goes, how far in the other goes. You can add different portions along the line of the actual swatch itself so that you can change some of the colors and, you know, manipulate the appearance. So you have quite a few options to change how it's going to look. And you can just play around with that. Again, the switch and reverse gradients option is still available, so you can still do that. Now, the one thing you'll find is, like I said before, this wasn't available in all versions of Illustrator. And unfortunately, if you were trying to do something of this nature, you had two real options. One is you had to create individual shapes to connect. And you would have to create this portion, and let me show you this again. We're going to cancel that out and go here. If you were creating individual gradients, you would have to create a gradient that went from this part to this part and do the gradation there, and then one from here to here for this section, for this type of gradient specifically, and here to here. Alright, until you got it all the way around to where you needed to be. Your other option would have been if you had a, let's say you were starting with, and the last one was if you had apply gradient along stroke. That's how you would do it. If it was apply gradient within stroke, the way you could do that is you could turn your stroke itself into a fill. And everybody knows by going to Object and Expand, you could expand your fill in your stroke, and it would change, if it's already a stroke, it would change that stroke to a fill. And then you'll notice now it's set in the fill aspect as opposed to being in the stroke. And then you could do the gradient option that this one had, which was a line gradient within stroke. Okay, now the other option, which is your last option, is apply gradient across stroke. The only way that you would have been able to do something like this would have either been by our first means, which was to apply the gradient using separate individual points going from point A to point B, but in this respect you would actually go from point A to point B here, creating your gradient. And let me go back here and just switch it to the one that we're looking at. So you would go from point A to point B here, A to point B here, A to point B here, and A to point B here, which is extremely annoying and difficult, but it's a way that you would have been able to do it. That, or you would have been able to create a gradient mesh, and then you would have created this as a solid point. Let's say we're going to get rid of all of these. Let's say we had our gradient mesh and it was a rectangle like this. We could create a mesh point here and here, here, and here, and then we could adjust them accordingly, because your mesh points would then, in an ideal world, align themselves according to where they intersect, like so. The only problem is, because the space is here, it would make it difficult for your mesh lines to actually read how it's reacting to that. So you might get some warped areas. Or You could just do a general mesh, which would have your shape as a solid shape, place a mesh point here that's black, like this is going from black to white, and then a mesh point here that's white, and it would do your mesh, which in terms of how it would show it would be a gradient from all four directions, black to white. And then you could use a clipping mask to clip out this area of the shape and only maintain the bounding box area, which will essentially give you this. If you don't know how to do that, you need to look into the mesh tool tutorial as well as the clipping mask tutorial that I developed. So take a look at those if you do not have a higher version of Illustrator and you don't have the stroke options. If you do, then you don't have to worry about it. It's a breeze, it's easy. But if not, then these are your workarounds for if you do not have a higher, more up-to-date version of Adobe Illustrator. So whenever you get a chance, check out those tutorials. Even if you do have a newer version, you still may want to learn these techniques. It may help if you ever get a job and they don't have an updated version of it, or you're utilizing somebody else's computer in an emergency. You may need to know that. Alright, so check out the other tutorials and we'll be touching base soon with some new stuff. Alright, take care.